Among all the secrets buried by the Second World War, few remain as intact as the one involving a respected German general, dozens of French women who disappeared without a trace, and a nickname whispered in military corridors that should never have existed. The bunnies, the little bunnies. It was not a concentration camp. It was not a forced sterilization program. There were neither gas chambers nor crematorium. What happened to these women was something that official history preferred to ignore because it did not fit into any known category of atrocity, because those responsible were never judged, and because the few survivors who tried to speak were silenced by a truth so disturbing that the post-war world simply decided it would be more convenient to pretend it never existed. The story begins in 1942 when the German war machine controlled France with impeccable bureaucratic efficiency. Every prisoner had a number, every deportee had a recorded destination, every execution generated a report. The Nazi system, as brutal as it was, kept obsessive records of almost everything, but in certain administrative sectors under the indirect influence of General Heinz, a pattern began to emerge that defied all this documentary logic. Young women were removed from the normal sorting flow and disappeared completely from the records. They did not officially die. They were not transferred to known camps. They were not on the forced labor lists. They simply vanished from the records as if an administrative eraser had wiped out their existence, leaving only empty spaces where their names should have been. The guards working in the detention centers in the Chartres region and surrounding areas began to notice something strange. Some prisoners received different treatment. They were kept apart, regularly fed, subjected to constant medical examinations conducted by military doctors who never explained the purpose of these evaluations. These women did not scream, they did not cry, they did not try to escape. Witnesses described a state of unsettling calm, as if something within them had been carefully removed. Among the administrative staff, a nickname emerged that no one could fully explain, but everyone instinctively understood. The rabbits. Laboratory animals, creatures kept in clean cages, observed, controlled, useful for purposes no one dared to question out loud. General Heinz was recognized as one of the most brilliant military strategists of the Wehrmacht. His armored warfare tactics revolutionized ground combat. His reputation after the war remained relatively intact. He was interrogated by the Allies, provided technical testimonies on military operations, and died in 1954 without ever facing charges related to crimes against civilians. In military history books, his name is associated with tactical genius, iron discipline, and strategic vision. Never to disappearances, never to women, never to dark experiments conducted far from the battlefields. In improvised medical facilities where decisions were made without witnesses and without official records that could survive post-war scrutiny. But personal documents seized from officers who served under his administrative influence tell a different story. Private letters mention special units that must be kept in ideal conditions. Diaries vaguely refer to favorable omens and the importance of keeping certain symbolic elements nearby during prolonged campaigns. Internal reports with no clear recipient mention psychological balance and personal valuables that should accompany troop movements. Nothing explicit, nothing that could be used in court, only textual fragments suggesting a mentality or superstition. Obsessive control and systematic dehumanization walked together, creating a space where real women were transformed into something intermediate between human beings and symbols, between prisoners and living amulets. Whoever listens to this story now, anywhere in the world where memories still matter and where uncomfortable truths deserve to be faced, might wonder how such a thing was possible, how women can disappear in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses and never be seen again. How did an obsessive bureaucratic system manage to erase the traces so completely that even today there are no official lists, no full names, no identified photographs? The answer lies in the very nature of the crime. It was not a massacre. It was not systematic torture. It was something more insidious, more difficult to address, easier to deny. It was the use of human beings as a psychological instrument, as an object of symbolic control, as a silent presence meant to feed illusions of power and order in minds that had already crossed all possible moral lines. The few surviving clues come from unlikely sources. A French nurse who worked under duress in German medical facilities mentioned in a testimony given decades later that some patients were treated with strange care, as if they were too precious to be harmed, but not important enough to have names. A German administrative employee captured by the Allies spoke during a routine interrogation about these women that the general kept near him, but refused to say more, and the subject was deemed irrelevant. French documents from the post-war period record attempts at investigations initiated by families searching for missing daughters, sisters, and wives. But all these investigations were abruptly halted without official explanation. Someone decided that certain questions should not be answered. Someone concluded that some secrets were better buried than exposed. The Second World War produced horrors documented in exhaustive detail. The extermination camps were photographed, witnesses survived, trials took place. Officials were punished, but there are gray areas that never received the spotlight, crimes that did not make headlines, victims who remained anonymous because their suffering did not fit, recognized categories of atrocities. The Lapines belong to this historical shadow. Women who were chosen not for who they were, but to represent something useful within a distorted logic. Women who were kept alive not out of compassion, but because their controlled existence served objectives never formally admitted. Women whose final destinies remain unknown because no one with enough power truly wanted to find out. This documentary does not offer a comforting ending. There is no posthumous justice. There are no names engraved on memorials. There are no identified photographs hanging in museums. What exists are fragments, whispers, empty spaces in archives where information should be. And a question that spans decades without a satisfactory answer: what exactly did General Heinz do with these women? Why were they separated? What purpose did they serve? And why, after the war, when so many Nazi crimes were meticulously investigated and punished, was this specific pattern of disappearance simply ignored? As if acknowledging its existence was more dangerous than pretending it never happened. The truth is buried somewhere between burned documents, erased memories, and deliberate decisions to forget. But the echoes remain, and anyone who is willing to listen carefully can still hear, between the lines of official history, the deafening silence of those who were turned into lapine and never had the chance to tell their own stories again. The Nazi bureaucratic machine operated according to an unyielding logic of classification and control. Every human being captured by the system was assigned a category, a number, a destination. The Jews were marked for extermination. Political resistors were interrogated, tortured, executed, or deported to forced labor camps. Prisoners of war had theoretical international conventions protecting them, even if these protections were frequently violated. Civilians arrested during punitive raids were either publicly shot as warnings or sent to camps where their labor could be exploited until deadly exhaustion. Each category had its place in the architecture of terror. Each fate was predictable according to the system's logic, but the women who became the guinea pigs did not belong to any of these categories. They existed in a deliberately created administrative void, a space where usual rules did not apply and where no one had the authority to ask questions. The German occupation documents in France reveal a meticulous obsession with documentation. Each ris Acquisition of food was recorded. Each arrest generated a report. Each execution required authorization signed by officers of appropriate rank. This obsessive paperwork served several purposes. It maintained the illusion of equality in a fundamentally criminal system. It allowed centralized control over vast territories. It protected individual officers by diluting personal responsibility in complex chains of command. But this same documentary obsession makes the total absence of official records concerning the rabbits all the more striking. No written order has been found authorizing their separation. No medical report explains the examinations they underwent. No transfer list indicates where they were taken. No death register records their eventual death. They were erased from the records with an efficiency that cannot be accidental. Someone with sufficient authority decided that these women should leave no documentary trace, and this decision was executed with a precision that suggests premeditation and awareness of future implications. Nazi racial propaganda classified humanity according to a delusional pseudo-scientific hierarchy. At the top, the Aryans represented genetic and cultural perfection. Below them were various categories of people deemed inferior but potentially useful. Slavs could serve as labor. The French, although conquered, retained an ambiguous status as a Western European people, and at the very bottom of this monstrous pyramid were those deemed worthy only of extermination: Jews, Roma, disabled people, homosexuals. This ideology permeated every aspect of the German occupation. It justified economic plunder. It rationalized arbitrary violence. It transformed human beings into resources to exploit or nuisances to eliminate. But it also created gray areas where individuals could be used in ways that did not fit any official category, where personal fantasies could attach to structures of absolute power, where individual madness could hide behind systematized collective madness. Heinz embodied a certain form of Prussian military professionalism. Son of an officer trained in elite military academies, he had devoted his entire life to the art of war. His theories on the use of armored units as a rapid and concentrated striking force revolutionized German military doctrine and enabled the early war's lightning victories. He was known for his emotional coldness, his ability to make difficult decisions without hesitation, his absolute demand on his subordinates. But the testimonies of officers who knew him personally also reveal troubling eccentricities. He harbored unusual superstitions for a man of his rank and education. He consulted astrologers, practices relatively common in the higher Nazi circles, but generally concealed. He attached excessive importance to certain personal objects that he considered lucky. He exhibited an obsession with order and control that far exceeded normal military requirements and took on almost ritualistic forms. And above all, he maintained a complex and never clearly explained relationship with the concept of omens and living symbols, as if certain people could embody abstract forces capable of influencing the course of events by their mere controlled presence. The detention centers established by the Germans in the Chartres region and the surrounding departments officially served as sorting points for civilian prisoners. People arrested during raids, routine checks, or collective reprisals were brought there, summarily interrogated, and then either released if deemed harmless or transferred to appropriate destinations according to their categorization. The process was supposed to be quick and efficient. But starting in the autumn of 1942, anomalies began to appear in the operation of these facilities. Some women did not follow the normal flow. They were separated upon arrival, often even before the initial interrogation. The selection criteria remained opaque. None were Jewish, which would have triggered a different protocol. None had known ties to the resistance, which would have justified special treatment. They did not belong to influential families, whose disappearance could have created diplomatic complications. They appeared to be ordinary French women captured under mundane circumstances, but something about their appearance, Their physique, behavior, or psychological profile destined them for a different fate. The fragmentary testimonies of guards and nurses who worked in these centers reveal disturbing details. The selected women were housed separately in quarters cleaner than the standard barracks. They received adequate food, not abundant, but enough to maintain their health. They were allowed to wash regularly, a very rare privilege in the Nazi concentration camp universe. Military doctors frequently examined them, checking their general physical condition without ever explaining the purpose of these examinations. No medical treatment was administered, no visible experiments were conducted. The examinations seemed simply to ensure that these women remained in good health, like monitoring livestock or valuable objects one wishes to preserve. And above all, they were kept in a state of unsettling calm. No open violence, no torture, but an atmosphere of constant psychological control that produced an almost supernatural docility. The French guards forced to work in these facilities used the term lapine, not out of cruelty, but because they couldn't find another word to describe these women with empty gazes, these preserved bodies but seemingly devoid of will, these silent presences that seemed to have accepted a fate they themselves did not understand. The logic behind this selection was never officially documented, but the available fragments suggest deeply troubling criteria. The chosen women were generally young, between 18 and 30 years old. They had a conventionally pleasant physical appearance, according to the European standards of the time. They had no visible disabilities or detectable chronic illnesses. But beyond these physical characteristics, it seems that a psychological element played a crucial role. Marginal notes in partially destroyed medical files mention terms like calm temperament, non-confrontational personality, observant eyes. An assessment dated March 1943 describes a prisoner as having a gaze that suggests understanding without judgment. Strange phrase in a military context, but it makes sense when considering that these women were not chosen for their work strength or political values, but for perceived symbolic qualities. They had to embody something specific in the twisted minds of those who selected them, something between an object of control and a living talisman, something that served unspoken but deeply felt psychological needs by men who wielded absolute power in a world that was collapsing. The rare administrative documents that indirectly mention these women use a revealing coded language. They are never called prisoners, but special units or reserve elements. They are not transferred, but repositioned. They are not detained, but kept under prolonged observation. This neutral bureaucratic vocabulary was used to conceal a reality that even those carrying it out seemed unable to clearly name. For how to classify a crime that fits no established category? How to document an atrocity that leaves neither corpse nor visible injury? How to justify a system where women are turned into symbolic objects meant to feed the superstitions of senior officers who claim to embody scientific rationality and civilizational superiority? The documentary silence was not accidental, it was structural. It stemmed from the very impossibility of admitting the existence of what was happening, because admitting it would have exposed a form of madness that undermined the very ideological foundations of the Nazi system. The winter of 1943 marked a troubling intensification of the phenomenon, as the German military situation deteriorated on all fronts and the psychological pressure on senior officers reached unbearable levels. The number of women disappearing into this administrative void increased significantly. The detention centers in Chartres, Orléans, and Tours all reported unexplained separations following the same pattern. But now, these women no longer stayed long in the local facilities. They were transferred elsewhere to destinations that were never officially recorded. Witnesses mentioned seeing small groups of silent women being loaded into military trucks in the middle of the night, accompanied not by ordinary guards, but by staff officers wearing insignia suggesting they served directly under higher command orders. These convoys departed. Without visible paperwork, without a written mission order, without a declared itinerary, they simply disappeared into the darkness, swallowed by a parallel logistics that operated outside normal military channels. A French nurse requisitioned to work in one of these centers described during a testimony given in 1967 a scene that haunted her until her death. She was summoned one night in January 1943 to examine a group of 7 women before their transfer. The examination was to verify that they were in good health, able to travel, free of contagious diseases. But what struck the nurse was not their physical condition, remarkably good given the circumstances. It was their behavior. They asked no questions, showed no visible fear, did not cry, did not plead. They simply stood there staring into space with an expression the nurse described as an acceptance beyond resignation, something deeper and more frightening, as if an essential part of themselves had already been extinguished. When the nurse tried to speak to one of them in French, asking her name, the woman looked at her for a long time without answering, then looked away as if the question made no sense. The officer's present immediately interrupted the interaction and ordered the nurse to complete her examination in silence. The next morning, the 7 women had disappeared. No document mentioned their departure. The few personal letters from German officers that survived the systematic destruction of documents at the end of the war offer fragmentary insights into the mentality underlying this system. A captain serving in the regional staff wrote to his wife in February 1943, a letter later seized by French intelligence services. He mentioned obliquely the general's special arrangements regarding certain required presences, adding that even in the darkest moments, he insists on keeping these elements nearby, as if their mere existence guaranteed a form of balance that none of us fully understands. The letter continued by expressing a growing unease. We are all accustomed to the necessary hardships of the occupation, but there is something in this matter that goes beyond military logic and touches on areas where I would prefer not to venture. The officer provided no explicit details, but the tone suggested he witnessed something that deeply troubled him while being unable or unwilling to name it clearly. Guderian himself maintained a facade of impeccable military rationality in all his official communications. His orders were clear, his reports precise, his strategic decisions justified by solid tactical considerations. But his immediate entourage reported increasingly eccentric private behaviors as the war turned against Germany. He insisted that certain personal items accompany him at all times during his travels: a pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather, a photographic portrait of his deceased mother, a small box containing family military medals. These objects had to be arranged in a specific way in his temporary quarters, according to an arrangement he periodically changed based on considerations no one else understood. He regularly consulted a personal astrologer, a habit he shared with other Nazi leaders, but he practiced it with unusual intensity. And above all, he showed an obsessive concern for what he called the balance of influences, a vague concept that seemed to mix personal superstition and a delusional belief that he could control destiny by manipulating appropriate symbols. In this twisted psychological context, the rabbits took on a sinister meaning. They were not ordinary prisoners destined for forced labor or extermination. They were not political hostages used to exert pressure. They were not subjects of medical experiments in the conventional sense, although their bodies were constantly monitored and kept in optimal condition. They were, in the distorted logic of their jailer, incarnations of absolute control. Human beings reduced to symbolic functions, living presences, whose very existence served to feed the illusion of power and order in minds desperately clinging to any form of certainty while their world was collapsing. The term dough perfectly captured this ontological reduction: guinea pigs, laboratory creatures, test subjects kept alive not out of compassion, But because their controlled existence served purposes that went beyond their individuality and was turning into an instrument of a profoundly sick psychology. The testimonies of survivors are rare and fragmentary, as most of these women never returned. But in the 1970s and 1980s, a few voices emerged during historical documentation initiatives led by researchers specializing in the lesser-known aspects of the occupation. A woman, identified only as Marguerite in the archives, testified to having been separated from a group of prisoners in October 1942. She described weeks spent in an isolated wing of a converted administrative building where she and about 10 other women were kept in strangely decent material conditions. They received food twice a day, they could wash, they had clean clothes, but they had no explanation about their situation or any indication about their future. Doctors examined them regularly without ever speaking to them. Officers sometimes came to observe them in silence, taking notes in small notebooks. And gradually, Marguerite felt something break inside her, not because of physical violence, but because of the absolute uncertainty, the feeling of being observed like a specimen, of the dehumanization that occurred not through brutality, but by reducing her to the state of an object being studied. She was eventually released under circumstances she never understood, simply dropped off on a country road in the middle of the night and left there without explanation. For decades, she remained silent, convinced that no one would believe her story. Other fragments emerged from unlikely sources. A Catholic priest who kept a clandestine journal during the occupation mentioned in March 1943 having received a nighttime visit from a terrified woman who had escaped from a transfer convoy. She told him a confusing story about strange medical examinations, German officers who looked at her with a disturbing intensity without ever touching her, and an omnipresent feeling of having become something less than human in their eyes. The priest hid the woman for a few days, then helped her join underground networks that led her to the free zone. She then disappeared from history, probably under a false identity. The priest noted in his journal that he had never seen such a combination of terror and shame in a person, as if she felt guilty for something she couldn't even name. The psychological implications of this system go beyond the usual categories of atrocities. Torture leaves physical scars. Forced labor exhausts bodies to death. Extermination produces corpses. But what was done to the female rabbits operated on a different level. It was a form of ontological violence that attacked not the body, but the very identity of the person. Being constantly observed, being kept alive without a clear reason, being treated with a disturbing care that had nothing to do with compassion, being turned into living symbols in the service of control fantasies whose logic was not understood. This experience caused a disintegration of the sense of self that could be more destructive than direct physical violence. The women who survived carried this invisible wound throughout their lives, often unable to talk about it because the language available to describe Nazi crimes did not capture what had happened to them. In the spring of 1944, as the Allies prepared the landing that would liberate France and the collapse of the Nazi regime became inevitable, the system of the Lapines entered its final and most troubling phase. Fragmentary documents suggest a frantic acceleration of transfers, as if someone was trying to hide evidence before the arrival of the liberation forces. The detention centers that had served as sorting points for these women were suddenly emptied. The prisoners who remained there disappeared within a few nights, taken in unknown directions. The French administrative staff, who had worked under duress in these facilities, were either abruptly dismissed or transferred to other positions, dispersed in such a way that no group retained an overall view of what had happened. And when the Allied troops finally advanced through the region, they found buildings emptied of any compromising content, records burned, archives turned to ashes. A British intelligence officer tasked with interrogating French collaborators after the liberation noted a troubling anomaly in a report dated August 1944. Several witnesses independently mentioned phantom women who had been detained and then disappeared without a trace. But when the officer tried to delve deeper into these allegations, he encountered a wall of silence. The witnesses suddenly became vague, claimed to have misunderstood, retracted their statements. The British officer concluded that either these people were afraid of reprisals or they were protecting secrets they preferred to keep buried. He recommended a more thorough investigation, but his recommendation was dismissed. In the chaos of liberated France, with millions of displaced people, thousands of collaborators to judge, and massive reconstruction to organize, the story of a few dozen women who disappeared under obscure circumstances was not a priority. The file was archived and forgotten. Guderian himself survived the war and passed relatively unscathed through the denazification process. He was questioned mainly about his military activities, his strategic decisions, his role in the German offensive campaigns. No interrogator asked him questions about the civilian detention centers operating in the regions under his indirect administrative influence. No investigation was conducted into the disappearances of French women in these areas. Either the Allies were unaware or they deemed the subject insufficiently important to warrant prosecution. Guderian wrote his memoirs, gave interviews to military historians, and lived comfortably until his death in 1954. In his public writings, he never mentioned the rabbits. He never alluded to the special units or reserve elements. He maintained until his death the image of a military professional who had simply served his country according to the codes of his time. And no one pressured him enough for this facade to crack, but the women who survived the system carried invisible scars until their own death. Marguerite, the woman who testified in the 1970s, described recurring nightmares that haunted her for decades. In her dreams, she found herself again in that white, cold room, naked under the gaze of doctors in lab coats who took notes without ever really seeing her. She woke up with the feeling of being turned into an object, something observed and catalogued. She developed an inability to bear being looked at for too long. She avoided medical exams her entire life, even necessary ones, because they awakened terrors she couldn't control. And above all, she lived with survivor's guilt, wondering why she had been released while others had disappeared, torturing herself with the question of whether she had served something monstrous without understanding it. If her body and presence had fueled rituals or beliefs she couldn't even imagine. Another survivor, identified only as Solange in the records, testified briefly in 1982 before refusing any further contact with the researchers. She had been captured in November 1943 during a reprisal raid after a resistance attack against German soldiers. Separated immediately from the main group, she spent 3 months in what she described as a strange purgatory where nothing terrible happened, but everything was profoundly wrong. She was regularly examined by doctors who checked her health without explaining why. She was photographed from various angles, always in clean civilian clothes, always against neutral backgrounds. She was observed by officers who came to watch her in silence for long minutes, sometimes taking notes, but never speaking to her. And then, without explanation, she was transferred in an ordinary convoy of political prisoners destined for a labor camp in Germany. She survived the deportation and returned to France after the liberation, but remained silent for nearly 40 years. When she finally agreed to speak, it was simply to say, "He was turning us into something. I do not know what, but I still feel that transformation within me." As if a part of my humanity had been taken away and never returned to me. Historical investigations conducted in the following decades constantly encountered the same obstacles: lack of official documents, witnesses dead or untraceable, survivors too traumatized to testify or who refused to relive those memories. French and German authorities were unwilling to reopen embarrassing cases and, above all, the impossibility of classifying these crimes according to established legal categories. It was not genocide in the strict sense. It was not a documented medical experiment like those conducted in concentration camps. It was not a forced labor system. It was something else, something that lay in a gray area between different forms of atrophy. Something that defied the precise legal definitions necessary for legal proceedings. The historians who discovered these fragments had to and were content with asking questions without being able to provide definitive answers. In the 1990s, a French researcher specializing in the history of women during the occupation attempted to reconstruct the system of la penis by cross-referencing archives scattered across several countries. She gathered fragmentary testimonies, partially destroyed administrative documents, personal letters seized after the war, and Allied intelligence reports never fully utilized. What emerged was a disturbing portrait of a parallel system operating in the shadow of the official occupation, serving the unacknowledged psychological needs of senior officers who wielded absolute power in a collapsing world. But when the researcher tried to publish her findings, she encountered unexpected institutional resistance. Publishers rejected the manuscript, arguing that the evidence was too fragmentary to support the conclusions. Academic committees expressed doubts about the methodology. And finally, exhausted by years of work leading nowhere, the researcher abandoned the project. These notes remain in university archives, occasionally consulted by a few specialists, but never turned into accessible public accounts. Today, more than 80 years after the events, the mystery of the rabbits remains largely unknown to the general public. No memorial bears their name, no museum tells their story, no film has dramatized their fate. They remain historical ghosts, present only in the margins of official historiography from the Second World War. The few historians who know this story mention it in a footnote as a troubling curiosity, but difficult to document solidly. And the survivors, those who lived long enough to see the new millennium, took their secret to the grave, choosing silence over the pain of reliving what was done to them. This silence raises fundamental questions about how we understand and commemorate atrocities. The official history of the Second World War was built around clear categories: the Holocaust, war crimes, bombings of civilians, mass massacres. These categories allow for a direct moral understanding. The victims are identifiable, the executioners can be named, the crimes correspond to precise legal definitions. But what do we do with the gray areas, crimes that leave neither a corpse nor solid documentary evidence, victims who survived physically but were psychologically destroyed in a way that is difficult to articulate? Systems of oppression that operated through symbolic dehumanization rather than direct physical violence. The female rabbits represent a form of atrocity that escapes conventional historical narratives precisely because it does not fit into any established category. They were not killed, so they do not appear in victim accounts. They were not used for forced labor in factories, so they do not feature in the economic history of the occupation. They were not subjects of documented medical experiments, so they do not appear in accounts of Nazi medical crimes. They existed in a void, turned into symbolic instruments serving a pathological psychology that left no official traces. And this historical void perhaps reflects a broader truth about the limits of our ability to understand and commemorate all the forms that human violence can take. The psychological implications of this system continue to resonate even in the absence of official recognition. The descendants of the survivors sometimes carry traumas passed down from generation to generation without understanding their origin. A woman whose grandmother had been a lépine testified in the 2000s that her grandmother had always shown an inexplicable terror of prolonged gazes, avoided any sustained eye contact, and had developed a deep aversion to spaces where she felt observed. These behaviors were passed down to her daughter, then to her granddaughter, like echoes of an original trauma that no one completely understood. It was only when the granddaughter began genealogical research and discovered fragments of her grandmother's history that she started to understand the source of her family's unexplained fears. The question of why this system existed remains without a definitive answer. Was it simply the expression of control fantasies of a few senior officers who had the absolute power necessary to transform their private obsessions?
In reality,
Was it related to superstitions shared in certain Nazi circles where human beings could be transformed into living talismans supposed to influence destiny? Was it an extreme form of dehumanization that turned people into symbolic objects serving psychological purposes that even their creators might not have fully understood? Or was there something even more sinister, a coordinated program whose traces were so completely erased that it remains invisible even today? Historians who studied Guderian after the war found a man who carefully cultivated his image as a rational military professional. His memoirs contained no introspective passages about his personal beliefs or private practices. He presented himself as a disciplined servant of the state, a strategist who applied the principles of modern warfare with maximum efficiency. But those who knew him personally mentioned eccentricities that his public writings never admitted. His obsession with certain personal objects he considered lucky. His regular consultations with astrologers, his belief that certain presences could influence the outcomes of military campaigns, his tendency to attribute victories to symbolic factors rather than tactical realities. These traits suggest a man whose apparent rationality coexisted with deep superstition, creating a psychological space where human beings could be transformed into magical instruments supposed to guarantee success and control. In this context, the rabbits acquire an even more troubling significance. They were not just victims of a brutal system. They were components of an organized delusion where powerful officers tried to control destiny by manipulating living symbols. Their very existence served to reinforce the illusion of mastery in minds facing the gradual collapse of their world. And the fact that this system could operate for years without leaving solid documentary traces testifies to the ability of complex bureaucratic structures to conceal crimes that do not fit the expected categories of atrocities. The fate of the rabbits is not only their individual suffering as real and devastating as it was. This is also the question it raises about the limits of our historical understanding. How many other crimes have fallen through the cracks between established categories? How many victims have remained nameless because their experience did not fit any recognized narrative? How many forms of violence escape documentation and commemoration because they operate in ways that defy our usual classifications? The official history of the Second World War was written mainly from the traces left by the Nazi bureaucracies themselves. But what happens when these bureaucracies deliberately decide to leave no trace? When crimes are committed precisely in areas that documentation does not cover? The few survivors who agreed to testify all shared a similar feeling. The feeling of having been transformed into something less than human, not by direct violence but by a process of symbolic reduction that she did not fully understand. They were observed, measured, catalogued, kept alive, but stripped of all autonomy and meaning. They became objects in the eyes of their captors, not useful objects like tools or machines, but symbolic objects meant to embody abstract concepts of control and order. And this ontological transformation left scars as deep as any physical torture, invisible wounds that never fully healed because the post-war world had no language to name them nor structure to recognize them. Today, as the last direct witnesses of the Second World War disappear, the story of the Lapines risks sinking definitively into oblivion. The documents that could have definitively proven their existence were burned 8 decades ago. The perpetrators died without ever being confronted with their crimes. The victims remained silent or were not believed, and post-war society, focused on more visible and easier to document atrocities, chose not to look too closely into these shadows where unspeakable crimes were committed away from the spotlight of official history. But the echoes remain. In the nightmares of descendants who carry fears they do not understand, in the footnotes of historians who mention troubling anomalies without being able to fully explain them, in the dusty archives where fragments await someone to take the trouble to assemble them into a coherent narrative.
Coherent.
The mystery of General Heinz's Quellignius remains unsolved, not due to a lack of fragmentary evidence, but because this evidence never forms a complete picture according to the standards we require for historical truth, and perhaps that is the final lesson of this story. Certain atrocities escape precise documentation. Some victims do not leave easily identifiable traces. Some crimes operate in gray areas that our moral and legal categories do not completely capture. Recognizing these limits does not mean abandoning the quest for truth. This means accepting that human history contains shadowy areas where terrible things happened without leaving the evidence we would like to have, and that silence itself can be a form of testimony to what humanity is capable of when absolute power meets organized madness in circumstances where no one is watching closely enough to stop what is happening. Some stories never truly close. They persist in silence, in the empty spaces of archives, in the nightmares of women who took their secrets to the grave. The General Heinz's rabbits were neither the first nor the last victims of a system that turned human beings into symbolic objects. But their story remains buried precisely because it exposes a truth the world prefers not to face. That atrocities do not always bear the visible marks of violence, that some crimes destroy the soul without ever touching the body, and that official history, as exhaustive as it claims to be, leaves entire sufferings in the shadows simply because they do not fit into any recognized category. Each woman who disappeared into this administrative void was a daughter, a sister, a friend. Each had a name, dreams, a life that was taken not by a bullet or a crematorium, but by a more insidious dehumanization that turned her into a ghostly presence, serving a madness she never understood. And the fact that their stories remain largely unknown 80 years later is not an accident. It is a collective choice to look away, to prefer comfortable narratives over unsettling truths. This documentary exists to break this silence, to remind us that history does not belong only to those who left impeccable records, but also to those who were deliberately erased from those same records. Each viewing, each sharing, each comment becomes an act of resistance against organized forgetting. Those who listen to this story, wherever they are in the world, now bear the responsibility for this fragmented memory. The female rabbits have neither a monument nor a commemorative plaque. They have only voices like this one, stories like this one, listeners like you, who choose not to look away from uncomfortable truths. So ask yourself the question, how many other stories remain buried because no one took the trouble to unearth them? How many victims are still waiting for their stolen humanity to be acknowledged? The story you just heard is only a fragment, an opening to abysses we prefer not to explore. But ignoring these abysses does not make them disappear. It only makes us complicit in their perpetuation. If this documentary touched something in you, if these silent voices still resonate in your mind, then do not let this story die here. Subscribe to this channel that refuses comfortable narratives and prefers unsettling truth. Enable notifications so you don't miss any of the testimonies that official history has chosen to bury. Leave a comment. Share where you're listening from, how this story affected you, what reflection it sparked in you. Because every comment, every interaction becomes a form of digital memorial for those who never had a physical one. Every time someone writes, "I remember, this must not be forgotten," their story matters. The rabbits stop being anonymous ghosts and become, for a moment, human beings whose suffering deserves recognition. Your commitment is not just support for a content creator. It is an act of posthumous dignity towards women whom the world deliberately decided to erase. The story of the Lapines raises a question that spans all eras and systems. What do we do with victims who do not fit into any category, whose suffering defies our comfortable moral classifications? Do we ignore them because they complicate our simplified narratives of good versus evil? Do we erase them because acknowledging their existence would force us to admit that human horror takes forms we do not want to imagine? Or do we choose, despite the discomfort, despite the lack of evidence of the definitive, despite the silence of official archives, to preserve their memory precisely because no one else will do it? Each person who watches this documentary to the end becomes a guardian of a fragile truth. Share this story, talk about it, refuse organized forgetting. Because if we allow these women to disappear a second time, this time from collective memory, then we become accomplices in the original crime that turned them into ghosts. The rabbits are still waiting in the margins of history for someone to acknowledge that they existed, that they suffered, and that their story, as fragmentary and troubling as it may be, deserves to be told again and again until the silence is definitively broken.